Welcome to the breakout session 7, Mapping Poverty with Satellite Imagery and Machine Learning. We have with us Neal, who comes from Stanford University Lab for Artificial Intelligence. It has the right description. And as myself, a member of an organization who has plenty of household surveys, both past and current, it's with great interest that I see this topic coming along. So Neal will describe his work for, I think, about half an hour, let's say. And then there will be some time for questions and for discussion. So as soon as the last people trickle in, we can start in, give it another 30 seconds, and I think you can fire off. The floor is yours.
Should I start? Yeah. Hi, everyone. So today, the project that I'm going to be talking about, most of this work was published in Science last year. So you guys can go and look at the paper after this if you're interested in learning more. I wish the screen was a little bit bigger. Okay, so I'll try to talk for around half an hour because I heard that's about how long human adults can pay attention for. What is it? It's shorter than that? 17 minutes. Okay, great. So I'll talk for 17 minutes. And then we'll open up for questions. So I'm not going to spend too much time motivating this project because I think you guys all know a lot more about this than I do. The first SDG is eliminating poverty by the year 2030. For those of you who don't know, probably none of you, the international poverty line is $1.90 of consumption per day per capita. So that's not very much. It's like I took a cab over from my hotel today and it was like 10 euro, which I'm not sure how many dollars that is, but I'm pretty sure it's many multiples of that poverty line. But it's nice that we have all of these SDGs, but if we can't actually track our progress, then what good is setting all of these goals? So we need much better data in order to track our progress on these goals. So this figure kind of shows the data shortages in Africa, which is by far the poorest continent. And in many of these countries, there haven't been any nationally representative household surveys conducted in the last decade. And household surveys also have a few other drawbacks, which you guys are probably familiar with. They're very expensive. They're not conducted with very high temporal frequency. And they only cover a very small percentage of the population, usually less than 1%. So in effect, this leaves many of the poorest people in the world effectively invisible. So I'm from the US, so rich countries like the US can afford to take a very detailed census every 10 years, but many of the poorest countries in the world can't afford to do that. So we need new creative solutions to fill in these data gaps. So one idea that you might have is that we could use satellite images at night, so-called night lights, to help us predict poverty. So this is a relatively good idea. There's been a lot of research showing that nightlights are highly correlated with economic activity. So this is a pretty famous image of the world at night. Can anyone tell me where this is? No. Korea, yeah. Whoever said Korea, that's correct. So this thing that looks like water in the middle, that's actually North Korea. And then this very bright island-looking thing is South Korea. So you can see that nightlights are really highly correlated with economic development, and maybe they would be good for predicting poverty as well. But there's a couple problems with nightlights. There's two main weaknesses. One is that in the very poor parts of Africa, especially, nightlights aren't very useful because those parts of Africa are completely dark at night. So if there's no variation in your X variable, then you can't hope to predict any variation in your Y variable. The second weakness is that it's easily confused by population density. So a poor area that's very densely populated might look just as bright as a richer area that's that's more sparsely populated. So we're going to leave nightlights for a little bit, but keep it in your mind and we're going to come back to it. So another idea is to use satellite imagery, which lots of people have talked about. So this is kind of what traditional satellite imagery would look like. This is from Landsat, 30-meter resolution. So each pixel represents 30 meters on the ground. And then I'm going to show the same image, but with higher resolution satellite imagery. So you can see like that little triangle in the top left corner. That's still going to be there. So nowadays we have 3 to 5 meter satellite imagery taken at very, very high cadence. So this is imagery from Planet Labs. And we have even higher resolution imagery, but that's more targeted. So places like Digital Globe. So from these images, you can see that there's quite a lot of detail, and maybe we can pick out some useful features that would help us make good predictions about poverty or other outputs that we care about. This is just to give you guys a sense of the state of satellite imagery. So these CubeSats are little satellites that can be sent up in large fleets to image the world every day. Traditional satellites are maybe weigh a couple tons and cost about $500 million to send into space. These CubeSats are about maybe like 50 pounds. So you can send up, Planet Labs is planning on having a fleet of over 200 of these. And there's a lot of activity in this area right now. On the left, these are all companies that are sending up satellites and collecting data. And then on the right, different organizations that are using this satellite data to make predictions and do various kinds of analyses. All right, so this is actually something that Paula, I think, talked about in the last session. The inspiration for our project came from this NGO called Give Directly. And what they do is facilitate direct cash transfers to the very poor in Africa. And usually to do this, what they do is they send people out into the field and survey households to find the poor ones so that people can send money to them. But they had this idea that they could do this by looking at satellite imagery. So what they did was, or their insight was that villages that were poor usually had a higher proportion of thatched roofs versus metal roofs. And by identifying the roofs in the satellite images, they could estimate these proportions and then estimate basically these relative rankings between villages. I'm missing a slide. Okay, moving on. So if you look, as a human, if you look at these high resolution satellite images, you can see that there's a lot more data there than just the roof types. Using what we know about the world, you can say that the one on the left is kind of this busy shipping yard, and the one on the right is more of a rural or suburban area. But the thing is, to a computer, they don't have this prior knowledge about the world. So to a computer, this is just an array of numbers. So how do we make sense from all these raw pixel values? All right, so what Give Directly did was this kind of traditional computer vision approach. And I'm going to walk you through kind of the process that you would take if you were a traditional computer vision researcher. So if your goal is to use metal and thatched roofs to predict poverty, the first thing you would want to do is use some kind of rectangular template matching thing where you slide a rectangle across your image to find roof candidates. And then after you find those roof candidates, you need to classify them as either metal roof, thatched roof, or non-roof using features that you extract. Usually these might be color or gradient features. And then finally, once you've discovered these roof types, you can use the proportions of roof types as features to predict poverty using some kind of linear regression model or something. So when does this kind of approach break down? So it breaks down when you start to have harder problems. And let's take this one, for example. So this is kind of a fun example. We're going to try to train a computer to identify cats or kittens. And for human, this is very easy because, we've seen a lot of kittens, and we can kind of, these 4 pictures are all obviously kittens, even though there are some like adversarial examples in here. For example, this kitten is wearing a flower thing to disguise its ears. This one's hiding in a box, and this one is pretending to be a frog. But it hasn't fooled any of us because we know what a kitten is. But if you try to go through the same computer vision pipeline and train your computer that way to find kittens, maybe the first thing you would do is use a triangle template matcher to find ears. And then you would use some circles to try to find eyes. And then maybe you would try to find tails using some kind of thing. I don't even know how you would do that. And then the final step, if you found all of those things, maybe you would classify as a kitten. But you can see from these 4 examples that none of these have tails. You can't really see the years on 2 of them, and this just wouldn't work for a robust algorithm to find cats. So what should we do instead? So this is where deep learning comes in. So the idea behind deep learning is to have lots of layers of units, which kind of draw inspiration from the neurons in your brain. And the idea is that by feeding this deep learning model lots of examples of input images and lots of the corresponding animal labels, it will learn to automatically find features that are useful for predicting which image is what type of animal. So instead of you as the algorithm designer having to specify, hey, you should look for, if you're looking for a honey badger, you should look for claws and this white and black fur, it'll automatically learn to find those things from seeing lots of images. So this is an example of the kinds of features that are learned by these deep learning models. So you can see that the idea is that at the bottom layers where it's closest to the input, it basically learns to detect edges. And then as you go up in the hierarchy, it learns to put those simple features together into more and more complex features. So maybe at the beginning it would find edges, and then it would put those together into like rudimentary shapes. And then by the end of the thing, it would be able to predict like this is a car or a truck or whatever. So if we go back to the original task of trying to predict poverty from satellite imagery, I want to kind of contrast the 2 approaches, the traditional one and then the new deep learning approach. So in the traditional approach, maybe we would talk to a bunch of experts and get them to list out a bunch of the things that they think affect poverty. So maybe some of these things are the roof types or the presence of well-constructed roads or farmland. And then in the next step, we would design algorithms to detect roofs and then repeat this process for each of the features that we want to extract. So if you have lots of features, presumably there's lots of things that affect poverty. So you have to repeat this many times, and this becomes very expensive. And then finally at the end, if you do a good job of finding all of those features, you can then use them to predict poverty. On the other hand, we have the deep learning approach where we basically just collect a bunch of satellite images, make sure they have poverty labels, and then feed them into the model. And then the model automatically learns to discover the relevant features and then uses those to make predictions. And for most computer vision tasks, deep learning approaches are now the state of the art. So one question that you might have here is like, okay, so if you have a lot of satellite images with poverty labels, then you can train this deep learning model. But what happens if we don't have the poverty data? Because isn't that why we started working on this problem in the first place? Yeah, so as you can see, images are very high dimensional data. And they're very complex and very varied. So you actually need to feed your computer lots and lots of images in order to train a deep learning model. For these image classification tasks, we usually, the most well-known data set is called ImageNet, and there's actually 1.2 million images in that data set representing 1,000 different classes of objects. So we clearly don't have that much poverty data. So what are we going to do? We're going to use this approach in machine learning called transfer learning. The basic idea is that if we have a task that's hard, for example, in the poverty case, this task is hard because we don't have enough data. We're going to start with an easier task and then train our model on that task and then apply what we learned, the transferable skills that we learned, to solve the task that we actually care about. So this is just an analogy for that I really like. There's a movie called Cool Runnings where there's a bobsled team in Jamaica that wanted to compete in the Winter Olympics. And unfortunately in Jamaica there's no snow or ice because it's very hot, so they train on this dirt hill in a bathtub on wheels. But they learn a lot of transferable skills, and then they're able to go and compete in the Winter Olympics. And I don't think they won, but at least they weren't embarrassing. So in our case, what we're going to do in this transfer learning approach is we're going to go back to the nightlights. And we're going to use that as a proxy measure to train our model. So nightlight data is very easy to collect because we just need to take a satellite image of the world at night. And then we can train our deep learning model to predict nighttime light intensities instead of poverty labels But in that process, it'll learn to identify features in the daytime satellite imagery that are predictive of night lights. Our hypothesis is that some subset of those features that are good for predicting night lights will also be good for predicting poverty. So this is just a diagram that's kind of showing how the whole pipeline is working. So we have input daytime satellite images on the left. These are high-resolution satellite images. In our project, we use satellite images with 2.4 meter ground resolution. And then each of these satellite images is labeled with a nighttime light intensity class. So we have 3 classes of nighttime light intensities, low, medium, and high. And then we train this deep learning model, which is called a convolutional neural network. A CNN is a type of neural network that's kind of optimized to operate on images. And then after this model is trained, we can use it as a fixed feature extractor so that we can pass in an input image and then map it into some vector of features that can then be used to predict poverty. So to go back to the nightlights thing, how is this better than just using nightlights directly? So for one, it gets rid of that problem of no variation in the very poor parts of Africa because there is variation in the daytime satellite images. Because the daytime satellite imagery contains much richer information than just one nightlight's value. But the nightlights are useful to us because they can help us in learning these features. So these are some of the features that our model learns to pick out. The top are the input satellite images, and then the bottom is what's called an activation map for four of the neurons in our network. So the first one, you can see it kind of looks for urban areas. The second one is kind of the complement of that. The third one obviously looks for water, and then the last one looks for roads. And this, you may have heard that if you've read a little bit about deep learning that these models are often not very interpretable. That's definitely true, but by doing feature visualization exercises like this, it gives us some confidence that the model is learning to find things that are kind of intuitive to humans. So after you have these features, we combine them with the small amounts of survey data that we do have to fit a simple linear regression model. And then we can use that linear regression model to make predictions of consumption or assets or whatever other output that you care about. So one thing that was kind of important for us to find out was if these models could be applied across country borders. For example, there's some countries like Somalia, I believe, that haven't ever had a survey done. So it would be impossible to train a model to make predictions in that country using data from that country because it doesn't exist. But if you can train a model in a different country and then apply it in a country where there's no data at all, that would be really powerful. So we did some analysis to see if this kind of domain adaptation would work well, and it seems like it does. So here are some examples of the types of poverty maps that we can create after we make these predictions. We can make predictions at any resolution that we have satellite imagery available for, but as you would expect, it's very noisy because the model is only making predictions from what it can see in the imagery. And you can have, like a field right next to an urban area. So it would make very different predictions for those places. When you aggregate them up to the district level, it starts to look more coherent, as you can see here. So this is Tanzania and Uganda. And then another example. So Malawi is on the left here, and Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world. And then Nigeria is on the right, and I think, so I've never actually been in these places, but from what they tell me, Nigeria is much better off than Malawi, and especially in the south where there's, I guess, abundant natural resources. Yeah, so if you're interested in the research, in this kind of research, this is a link to our group's website, so you can check out some of our other work. We've also done some stuff on predicting crop yields, and we're interested in kind of expanding this analysis to all of Africa in the next few months. So, thank you.
Well, you came in at 17 minutes, so it's perfect fit in there. So the floor is open to the questions. There's one over there. I think there's someone with a microphone over there, yes.
I have some more slides too. That wasn't long enough. So.
Oh, that's you have plenty of time, so.
else is first over there, were they?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so I'll thank you for a very interesting, logical presentation. I was just thinking of an example when a lot of rapid evaluations use indicators to interpret things like poverty. And one quite widely cited example is comparing at different points of time to see how many metal roofs there are, zinc roofs, or how many of the windows have grills, which is an indication of poverty. And if you go back doing this rapid evaluation and you find that there are more metal roofs or more grills on the window, it's often interpreted to mean that the community has got wealthier. What very often has happened is that the poor people have been kicked out and the people who live there now are better off. But so if you don't have some interpretive background, you say this project has been successful because people are better off, where in fact it's been a failure because people have been kicked out. And so I mean, that's just a very simple example of how you need to have some sort of framework for interpreting the data, which obviously you have many more dimensions which come in here, so you don't fall into quite that simple trap, but somebody needs to be explaining. Just one other very dramatic example. In Indonesia, there's a lot of people who come from the outer islands, and they don't want to spend any money at all in Jakarta, so they've got reasonably good jobs, but they literally live in cardboard boxes because they're just saving all of their money to take back home with them. But all of the studies classify these people as being very, very poor because you just, again, use these sort of indicators. So this is just a cautionary tale, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but just the point about having to bring in some knowledge of the context as well. So.
Yeah,
Do you want to respond to that, or should I?
No.
Thank you. A very interesting presentation. Just a quick question. When you were presenting, I was sitting here thinking, how can we apply, this, like for institutions like, IFAD. So I'm Kashi. I'm working in this research and impact assessment division here. We do a lot of poverty analysis in Africa and South Asia, of course. So how accessible is this data? This is cool, and we would like to do this kind of thing on comparing what we have microeconomic household data with this kind of satellite imagery data. So that's my first question, how accessible this is for us, and how can we do that? And another is, if I understand correctly, this imagery data is unable to predict household level poverty. This is like more macro type thing. So is there any plan, or can this be extended to household level poverty? Prediction or something like that.
Maybe you can answer some of the questions, or you prefer to
sure.
pile a few in?
Yeah, that's better before I forget.
Yeah, otherwise
the questions.
You might forget. So let's just maybe take two, and you answer two, and then we go. The next gentleman is there, yeah, and then afterwards Gaurav, and over there, and there.
Yeah,
okay.
so I guess I'll start with the first one. I think that's a very good point. There are a lot of things that came up in the last session that I think are very relevant here. So I guess to address this directly, I think I'm a big proponent of having like human in the loop machine learning systems. There are a lot of things that the machine learning model doesn't know about, right? So I think you shouldn't be trusting these things just to like make decisions for you. Humans, there's still a lot of things that humans are better at than machines. So we should use humans for those things. But there are a lot of advantages that machines also provide. For example, you could never hire enough analysts to look at, 200 million satellite images or something. So you should really build these kind of integrated systems where there's humans in the loop so that both sides can kind of do the part that they're better at. What was the second question again? How can you implement this?
The one was accessible, and
okay. This slide kind of covers this. So what you need to do, I think, so if you guys want to implement this, I think there's already some groups who have started doing this. So maybe you should all talk to each other too internally. But you might actually have a much better time doing this than I do because your data sources should be much better than mine. So this project was actually done without any funding. We had one computer with one GPU. You probably have better computational resources than that. What you need to do is you need to collect satellite imagery. Our imagery came from the Google Static Maps API. Our household survey data came from the DHS and LSMS surveys. We had like the publicly available version of this, which has location jitter. So I think you guys probably have access maybe to the non-jitter data, which would reduce the noise in your training data. In terms of the tools that you would need, we use Python and TensorFlow. We used to use Caffe, which is another deep learning framework, but we don't use that anymore because it's not as good as these newer tools. You need some GPUs to train your models on, or CPUs if you want to wait a long time for them to train. And then to validate your models requires some other ground truth data. So usually what we do is you split your data set into training and test. And then the last part of the pipeline is just to use your trained models to make predictions and then whatever other deliverables you want. And we have some ideas for maybe future applications. This also kind of touches on the thing from the last session where I don't want to make any claims about like learning, I don't know, causal relationships between things. I don't think that's what machine learning models are good for, but you do have some control over what the model is trying to do by designing your training objective, right? So if you want to predict poverty very, very well, and you have lots of data, I believe that you can probably do that best by using some kind of deep learning model, even though it might not really teach you what the fundamental causes of poverty are. But I'm sure there's applications where predictive accuracy can get you a long way, and I think that's what these things are good for.
I think there was also a second question on the on the expansion to the household level, no?
I mean, suppose we don't know the deep learning methods or anything, that sounds very complicated to us, but like we would like to use the satellite imagery. Is there like a model that your group develops and then we can use? Or I think that was like a question made.
Yeah, so we posted the model parameters online. It's not something that you can use like out of the box, but it shouldn't be too terribly complicated to get working either. Hopefully that's true. I think some people in this room have tried and succeeded. And then the other question about household level predictions, sorry, I skipped that earlier. We don't have data at that level. We don't have training data at that level, so we can't really make predictions at that level. We could make village level predictions and then just use those for household predictions and kind of evaluate to see how well it does on that. But that's probably all we could do for now. But in the future, if you had better data, then you could try to do something like that.
The gentleman there first, and Gaurav, and then there. I think I got the sequence correctly. Hopefully, I was turning this way, but.
Well, thank you very much, Neal. Thanks for the presentation. Also, my comment is just a quick addition to Michael's intervention, and in terms of what satellite imagery tell us and what the realities sometimes are. And that is what he's talking about, framework, and I call that a context. It's important to put all this in the right context. So, for instance, you would, from satellite imagery, you may realize that thatch roofs may have changed to metal roofs, in the same way the reverse can hold. And the reason is that in some parts of my country, I come from Ghana, it gets so hot that the thatch roofs give you a better ambience temperature within. So people really move away from the metal when they cannot probably put in air conditions. But the thatch roofs give you very, very, cool temperatures for the afternoon. So it's not that people move because they are rich or they are poor. People rely on their situations to take decisions, and I think the satellite imagery will give us an indication of what may have changed, but what led to the change is also important to decipher. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Gaurav. I'm a data scientist at WFP. So my question is, we operate in the tail end of the population distribution, like people that are already below the poverty line and maybe many steps to the left of that. So how can you use this to actually distinguish between areas that are already impoverished, especially when the distinguishing factor, let's say in terms of food security, agricultural production, areas that may be on the verge of sliding into famine versus not, are actually kind of things that a convolutional neural network that's trained on picking up urban features, related to nighttime imagery, would not pick up. Like things like how green the area is, the NDVI index, the lushness of the vegetation, which is related to the agricultural output. How would you be able to now incorporate those things into a model that'll be able to distinguish, like I said, the incredibly impoverished from the right on the borderline impoverished?
I don't have too much to say to the first comment besides that I completely agree with that. Like I said earlier, I think these machine learning models, they only know what they see in the data, right? So they only draw these statistical correlations, but they don't actually know what's generating that data. So that's why I think you need to have a human involved in these like decision-making processes. For the second one, yeah, so there's definitely, this is kind of our first stab at this. So we are leaving out a lot of potentially useful information. For example, right now we're only using the RGB channels of these satellite images. Other channels such as like near infrared probably tell you a lot about vegetation, like human-built structures, but we're not using any of that. So one simple way that maybe you could combine these different sources of information is by having your model extract these daytime satellite images that are derived from nighttime lights and then concatenating on any other features that you care about. For example, like your NDVI or whatever. And then feeding that concatenated feature vector into a linear regression model or some other model. Right, yeah, so you could have some combination of a traditional approach combined with this deep learning feature extraction approach. Yeah. And that's probably the simplest way you could do it. You could probably think of smarter ways to do it, but that would be one simple and easy way to incorporate other information.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation and for the work. We have built our work in the roof counting based on your work, so from PostLab Kampala, so thank you for that. My question is about the household survey and the satellite imagery for the collect data. And this I miss it in your presentation, so it's just a request to explain it a bit more. The way I see it, you're taking the household data that is based on sample, okay, and then the results are normally a sub-regional level. But then my question is, are you using that then and you are extrapolating there and you're getting district level data that you know what I mean? Like from a level to the other, from the roof, the unit, to the data that is coming from the household survey, that is coming from a sample size, that is coming from the region. How do you bring those together?
Yeah, so maybe I can explain how GiveDirectly did it first, and then I'll explain how we did it. So what they did was they had these maps of different villages, and then within each village they would compute the proportion of different roof types, and then they would use those to rank the villages in terms of wealth. So what we did is these surveys, they come in these like enumeration areas. I think they roughly correspond to villages in rural areas and like urban wards. And each of these usually, depending on the survey, has maybe 10 to 20 or 20 to 30 households. So what we did was we averaged the data within each cluster and then used that to train the second level model with the input image features. And then the image features came from, because there's up to 5 kilometers of jitter added to these survey results, we would take a bounding box that's 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. So that would be 100 different images, since each of our images was 1 square kilometer. And we would extract features from all 100 of those images, average them, and then use that as the feature vector corresponding to that cluster. And then we would train our model to use the average feature vector from that cluster to predict the average household consumption within that cluster. And the way we did validation is just through standard like tenfold cross-validation.
Thanks for a great talk, Stuart Schulman, TechSifter. I was really interested in the comment about deep learning and feeding it labeled data to let the CNN discover the features. I'm assuming some of those features are going to be useful and other of those features are going to be not. Is that where the human in the loop piece comes in, is discriminating between which features are actually contributing to a better model and which ones are not? And also, thank you for mentioning human in the loop. I think it is the most parsimonious response to the concerns of the big data panel about machines without humans, which I think is a bit of a straw man.
Yeah, so that's, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about human in the loop in that way. So the way that we actually decide which features are useful or not is we just use those features and train this second level regularized linear regression model. And the regularization basically does feature selection. So it figures out automatically which of those features are useful for the test that you care about. One thing that doesn't give you is it doesn't make those features interpretable necessarily. For example, the 4 that I showed, like the urban, non-urban, water, and road, those are kind of cherry-picked examples. So we actually have 4,096 features, and 4 of them happen to look like things that a human might pick out. The other ones mostly look like just random stuff that we can't really interpret, but somehow the computer thinks that it's good for predicting nighttime lights. Yeah.
One more. Okay.
No, we do a lot of work with actual survey data to estimate and predict poverty. And you have the poverty incidence as the measure. What is the ultimate measure here? Is it a visual measure? And the other question is related to the variation over time. I mean, what is like the frequency of the estimates where change can actually be reliably captured?
Sorry, was your first question, what is the measure of poverty that we're trying to predict?
Yeah.
Okay, so in our paper, we actually tried to predict 2 different measures. One is the average household per capita consumption. So that, I think that's like the standard poverty measure. And then the other one that we try to predict is this wealth index that's constructed from this asset matrix that's collected by the DHS. So they basically ask people, do you own a car? Do you own a microwave, a refrigerator? And then they build all of this into a data matrix and then do some kind of singular value decomposition or something and find the first principal component and then use that as the asset index. And then that's what we try to predict.
Right. And how far away is your estimates from the actual existing survey, best survey?
Oh, so the way, yeah, so we get R-squareds depending on which output we're trying to predict. For consumption, it's a little bit harder. So we get R-squareds between like 0.4 and 0.5. And then for assets, we get R-squareds as high as like 0.7.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to just make sure that I'm not missing a step in understanding how you were controlling for variation in places where you don't expect to see, you expect there to be a lot of variation in welfare or poverty, but in terms of like light at night, there's not too much of it. Mm-hmm. So I get that you're saying that you're using daytime features of a community and you're using that to predict the level of light at night in other places. Yeah. And then are you assuming that those same features are comparable in a place that does not have light at night, that those relationships will hold over or carry over?
Yes, yeah.
I guess my question about that is that if there's a fundamental difference between some places having a lot of variation in light and some places having none, but we understand that, how confident are you in that assumption, that those same patterns will be valid for places where there's no light at night?
Yeah, I think That's definitely a potential weakness of this. So maybe one example of this is the thing that I talked about where we would train a model on data in one country and then try to apply it in a different country. So in general, when you this is called like a domain adaptation problem. So if the data in your training set comes from a different distribution than the one in your test set, you're usually going to do worse on the test set. So in general, there's no real like solution for this. But yeah, usually if you want your model to generalize, you have to make sure that your data is coming from a similar distribution. Sorry if that wasn't really like an answer. It's like a dodge, but yeah.
You didn't have to give that away. You sounded so smart. Hi, I'm Caroline Hyder. I lead the independent evaluation group at the World Bank Group. Did I understand you correctly that you said that your model, when it sort of analyzes the data, generates something like 4,900 characteristics, and then you found 4 that actually make sense, right? So the first question is like, how do you identify 4 and 4,900? Because that's sort of quite a big sort of jump. And then what's all the rest of the stuff about? Is this simply systems inefficiency, or is it something which can be used otherwise? Is it something that, you know, programming algorithms will become smarter about and we have less what looks like waste to me? I mean, like if you generate 4,900 sort of like parameters and you actually only 4 make sense, it looks inefficient.
Yeah, so the first question, the way that we identified those 4 is I looked at a lot of satellite images. So if you
back to the human.
Yeah. So this is the human in the loop part, grad student in the loop. So so you can look at the original input images with these activation maps for each feature. And so I just looked at, you know, thousands of these images and picked out 4 of the features that kind of made sense. And to answer the second question of like why find so many features if only 4 of them make sense, just because they don't make sense to a human doesn't mean that there isn't like kind of predictive value there. For example, maybe by looking at, so we trained this model on I think 400,000 satellite images. So that's more satellite images than even a grad student can hope to look at over the course of a project. So by looking at so many images, the computer can find relationships that we as humans might not even be able to pick up on. For example, maybe it learns that if an image has roads that are, you know, within like 85 to 95 degree angles of each other, that's like a good sign for predicting high nighttime lights or something. But maybe a human wouldn't really be able to say that, okay, these images look like they have, you know, 80% of the roads are within this angle, whereas like this other set of images doesn't fall into that category. So even like very subtle things like that, if you have enough data, you can kind of extract these relationships, but a human would not be able to through visual inspection.
Okay, so I know this issue has been raised by a few people, but what's your sense on doing a comparative study of this type across different countries? Because of course this type of stuff might not be sufficient to capture differential preferences or local conditions. So I would like to know what would be your take on, you know, advancing this type of study to capture like comparative stuff. And also another one is you mentioned calculating these composite indices to look at wealth because usually monetary indicators are difficult to come by. So again, these indices might have problems at the low end of distribution, just like the night lights. So what would be your take on you know, approaching these things as well? Thank you.
All right, you guys are starting to ask me questions that I'm not really an expert on. What was the first one? As comparative? What? I don't even really know what that means.
So it's like you do this type of study for several countries and see how you can aggregate the impact or changes, look at several countries at the same time?
Maybe we should take that offline later, and you can kind of explain what your question means.
Sure, sure.
The second one about construction of indices, it's also something that I don't know a whole lot about. I guess I have some intuitions about why these indices are easier to predict than these consumption measures. For example, the assets one, you can imagine that some of these assets are maybe actually visible from the sky, whereas consumption patterns are not really. And they're probably more stable for the consumption stuff. I think the surveys are based on they're like recall, so the person has to kind of remember what they spent money on over the last week or month or something. Whereas if you ask someone, do you have a car, that's pretty easy for them to answer. So I don't have good ideas about how to construct better indices, but I think if the people who do construct these things have an idea of how people working with the data farther down the pipeline might use this data, then they might be able to come up with better ideas. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Thinking through how you can use this for evaluation, are these measures sufficiently stable that you, and do you have the longitudinal data so you could use this to go back through time to create a baseline and then see what changes had taken place in your indicator of poverty? And if you could do that, could you then start thinking of having a comparison group where some of these areas you have your project intervention and try and match them with the techniques we heard about earlier, propensity score matching and so on, so you can begin to get a sort of quasi-experimental design. So the first question is, if you have this longitudinal data set over a number of years, saying that at the beginning you came in a certain position on a poverty scale, could you go back a number of years later and say it's changed, or are all of the dynamics changing, so it's not really a very good comparison? But if that is relatively robust, can you then think of having a comparison group where the project's working and not working, and start saying something about the potential effects of the project?
Yeah, that's something that our group is currently working on. There's some difficulties. A lot of these surveys are not panels, so it's hard to compare these households or villages directly across different points in time. Also, on the imagery side, the source of imagery that we used came from Google Maps, and they only have basically a cross-section, so we don't have high-resolution satellite imagery going back in time. We're trying to see right now if we can use lower resolution Landsat imagery and get similar results. It's lower resolution, but on the other hand, there's a lot of signal from the other spectral bands. So you maybe could hope to get similar performance out of those, using those images as input. I think going into the future, it'll be much easier to do this because of all these different satellite companies that are now launching these fleets of CubeSats that are going to provide high cadence imagery.
Any more questions? There's one question over there from Baptiste.
So I have two questions. So imagine you have access to household data and not the cluster, not only the cluster location, but the location of each household and their individual records, so their individual poverty level estimate. How would the model would behave differently, or you would apply the same kind of model? And my second question is, you say it generalizes quite well from one country to another, but have you tried to map the whole world with that model, or the whole continent of Africa? And well, that's third question, sorry. So I see you do cluster maps at the end. No, you do not cluster maps, you do district maps. So you aggregate at the district level. So basically you're doing more or less the same maps that you can find in a report from DHS, because this is the district, I guess, is the representative level where they do this kind of reports. Why not you do finer grain things. Like you said that a very fine grain would not make sense because you would have very different things next to each other, but I guess at 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer or 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer would be more interesting than doing the same maps that you can find in the GHS reports.
Yeah, I'll answer the second one first. So I don't remember exactly what I said, but I didn't mean to say that the finer resolution maps did not make sense. I just wanted to say that they can be quite noisy. So for example, if I put them up right now, they wouldn't look very coherent because you would have lots of different colors very close together, so it would just kind of look blurry. When you start to aggregate them, you get to see these kind of patterns that the human eye can pick up on start to emerge. That's one advantage over DHS, is that we can actually produce these higher resolution maps everywhere that we have imagery. Another advantage is that even though these DHS surveys are supposed to be representative, at least from what I've been told, they sample less than 1% of the population. So you're extrapolating a lot from that data, whereas we're making predictions at every single, at basically everywhere. And then the first question was about household level data. So I think as a general rule, all of these there's really no like out of the box machine learning solutions that just like work except for basic image classification tasks. So all of these things kind of have to be fine-tuned or adjusted to work on your particular data set. So I think you would have to you could maybe build on some of these principles that we've proposed, but you would have to, do a lot of tweaking to make it work for the household level predictions. Yeah. So I would take a different approach if I had that kind of data.
Okay, thank you.
Is there another question over there?
If I could add one thing from the previous session too, there's a lot of talk about big data. I also don't really know what that means. And I don't think anyone really has a good sense. From what I've seen, it's very application dependent. So if you want to do one thing, maybe a big data set is, in this case, like 500,000 images. If you want to solve a different problem, maybe you have 100 data points and that's enough to build a good model. So I think that's something that if you're ever working on projects, you should keep in mind that people often ask like, well, I have this problem, how many data examples do I need to collect before I can get good performance with my model? And I'm like, well, I have no idea because I don't know very much about your problem. I don't know what kind of model you're using. So it's all very application specific, I think. So context matters, I guess that's like the theme.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have another application level question here. So coming back to this asset index and other things. So we have this Uganda data. I'm also working in Uganda right now, actually. So we have consumption data, like from LSMS or DHS or whatever source, and we have assets data. So I'm creating poverty index based on consumption and then asset. So these two indices can be different. A household that is poor based on consumption may not be poor based on assets. So if you are predicting a poverty index based on satellite imagery, a poverty index predicted using satellite imagery, if you were to compare that with the consumption-based index using the micro-level data and asset-based index using the micro-level data, there are two things going on here, right? So you have in the satellite side, there's one satellite imagery, and in micro-level household, there are two things: assets-based poverty and consumption-based poverty. So what is the approach from satellite imagery perspective? If you are creating two maps, one map based on assets dimension from satellite and another map based on consumption dimension from satellite, would these two things be different or same? How do you, in the imagery perspective, how do you differentiate is an asset-based prediction and then it is a consumption-based prediction?
Yeah, so when you're training these deep learning models, you get to define the training objective. So if you say, hey, I want to be able to predict assets, then that's what your model is going to do. So it's going to try to predict assets as well as it can. And then if you say, hey, I'm going to give you consumption data, you should try to predict consumption, then it's going to try to predict consumption as well as it can. Whether or not these are going to be the same depends on whether or not your data looks the same along these 2 dimensions. You're saying that it doesn't, so I would guess that these maps would look slightly different. But they should be, if you train these things separately and use 2 different models, they should both be like basically as good of predictions for those outcomes as possible. And you. No, these are all consumption maps because asset maps, I guess the scale isn't as meaningful. So we weren't, even though we do a better job predicting assets, it's not as clear really what that means or whether it's consistent across countries. So this is a little bit more interpretable. I guess it's like a dollar amount, so you can kind of look at it and make sense of it.
Okay. Well, I think we have to bring things to a close. All the questions now must be addressed directly to the speaker. I've under orders to close the session. So I think it was very lively. We had almost a dozen questions. I'm not sure if it's a record, but just shows the amount of interest that your work has generated. Thanks very much for the presentation. And I think you have probably a queue of people forming to take things offline with you. Right.
Thank you
Thanks very much. Thank you.